We are delighted to be joined by the brilliant Tim Challies. Hello and welcome to Exposit The Word, Tim.
Hello, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you're here to talk about your fantastic new book and documentary series, Epic. But before we talk about that, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I am a blogger, author in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, or just outside Toronto in Ontario, Canada. I am a husband to Aileen. We've been married for 22 or so years, and father to 3 children who are currently 13, 17, and 20 years old.
Which one of your sons is the coffee connoisseur that you mentioned quite a lot in the series?
That's Nick. He's the eldest. He's 20 years old. He's a student at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary currently, though, of course, under the current conditions, he is back home and finishing out his year. He's in second year there, finishing out his year at home.
Okay, sure. So when did you first become a Christian, Tim? And also, when did you start blogging?
Sure, yeah. So I was raised in a Christian home. My parents were saved as college students and saved by Pentecostals and saved into Pentecostalism. And on their honeymoon, they decided to go to Switzerland and bumped into a guy there named Francis Schaeffer and ended up actually spending a year with at L'Abri and came back thoroughly reformed in their theology. So I was raised in the Presbyterian and or Dutch Reformed streams, and somewhere in there, just being raised in a Christian home by Christians, I became a believer. I don't have a firm date or time, but my mom would say it was probably when I was around 6. I would say it was more when I was a young teenager, so who really knows? But the Lord did save me. And I started blogging shortly after I got married. I got married in 1998. My parents moved to the States with my 3 sisters and brother around the year 2000. And I started blogging in 2001, sort of as a reaction to them being gone, just wanting to be able to share some things that were going on in my life. Blogs were new. There was no Facebook yet. And so it was social media. And so that was how I socialized with my family, by blog, hence Challies.com. And that just kind of grew out from there. Can
you remember the first blog that you posted that you thought, oh, wow, this is, you've really got an audience now? Can you remember the first one?
Yeah, it would probably be when I started doing reviews of the purpose-driven life. Sorry about that. It's my smoke detector doing its monthly self-test. I think it was probably around when I started doing a review of the purpose-driven life. At that point, I was at a Southern Baptist church. The Southern Baptists had sort of made a move into Canada. I had joined one of those churches, and they were going through the purpose-driven life. And I was really uncomfortable with purpose-driven life, and I didn't really know why, so I just started analyzing it day by day through my blog. And it turns out at that time, people all around the world were going through purpose-driven life and going on this new thing called the internet and starting to see what they could learn about it and maybe why they were feeling a little uncomfortable with it. And so I think as I sort of blogged my way through that, that's where I started realizing, oh, now there's like 20 people a day reading the site, and then a couple hundred people a day reading the site, and just kind of grew out from there.
Yeah, so interesting. So tell us about this new series then, Tim, Epic, and also how did you come up with the idea?
Sure, yeah. So Epic is a journey around the world, also a journey through Christian history. So it's two different things. It's a church history book, but it's also a world travel book. And so a few years ago, I had the idea of trying to tell Christian history through objects. So what are objects that tell a story beyond themselves, or objects that are still in existence? You can see them in a museum, something like that. But they were particularly important in Christian history. And so I did some writing on that, kind of did a little blog series on it and enjoyed it. But something was missing. And I came to realize that something was actually seeing these things, actually exploring the world to look for them. And so I had that idea and mapped it out and realized this would be far beyond my means to actually be able to do it. But the day after I had finished mapping it out and kind of just put my hands up in surrender, somebody got in touch with me and said he represented a group of businessmen, and they were wondering if there's ever a project I'd come up with where money was the thing that was holding me back from doing it. Wow. And so I told them about the project, and they chose to fund it, and off I went. So it worked out really well. Wow. And I think it turned out really neat. I was really excited to do it and really excited with the finished product.
Yeah. When did you actually finish it, Tim?
I think it was late 2019. So it was almost 2 years from the first trip, which I ended up having to repeat. Actually, I had to repeat the first 2 trips. And then I think by the end it was, late 2019. So almost 2 years.
So you travelled over 180,000 miles, 24 countries, countless McDonald's, and one broken arm. Tell us about some of your favourite memories.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite memories is meeting Stephen McCaskill, who was the filmmaker who went with me. I met him in the airport on the way to our first trip together after we had agreed to do this whole thing. Yeah. So walked into an airport lounge, and there he was, and met him, and we had already agreed we were going to travel the world. So I was just really hoping he and I would get along well and be compatible, and it worked out great. We became very good friends and are still in touch on a daily basis. So that was a joy. Beyond that, I mean, there's so many good memories. There was, I always think of the south of India, going all the way down to Dohnavur Fellowship, which is the ministry that Amy Carmichael founded. Yeah. And walking into this ministry, having no idea what to expect. You don't really see pictures of it, and people don't go there. But walking into this mammoth compound full of hospitals and orphanages and homes and all of this, and just realizing the sheer scope of what she had built. And then talking to one of the gentlemen in charge there, and him just talking about the need for theological education, his concern about some of the poor theology, prosperity theology, and other things filtering across India. And it was just a real affirmation that this ministry founded so long ago is still pressing on, still doing the good work of the gospel. And even there, meeting this woman who was elderly now, but as an infant had been brought to this orphanage where she was received by Amy Carmichael, who took her in her arms and prayed for her and gave her her name. It was an amazing link between today and history.
It made me smile. I can't remember where it was that you went into a McDonald's, and you said that one of your intentions was to have McDonald's in every city that you went. It is so something that I would have done. And I'm so interested as well, Tim. Where is the best McDonald's in the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we went to 24 different countries, I believe. Yeah. And I think there were we went to McDonald's in every country where there was a McDonald's. So there's no McDonald's in Zambia. Yeah. So we couldn't go there, for example. But we did go to McDonald's in every country we could find it. There were various reasons for that, but mostly it was just we did that in the first couple countries and realized, why don't we just keep going? Why don't we just keep trying and try what their special thing is? So the best thing I had all year was a breakfast sandwich in Ecuador. I don't remember what it was called, but it was really, really good. Now, I'm biased toward McDonald's breakfast. I don't even like McDonald's that much. It just became a thing. I'm biased toward their breakfast, but that was fantastic. And the worst was either India's Maharaja Mac, granting I had it at about 4 a.m, or the Mega America burger in Jerusalem, which was horrendous.
Oh, I think that's the one that you showed on the documentary, if I remember right. Yeah. The timing of this documentary release is absolutely perfect. Pretty much the whole world is on lockdown at the moment, but through this documentary, I'm not sure if it's because of how you filmed it, Tim, but after each episode, you feel like you've actually been out on a day trip. How's it been received so far?
Yeah, I think it's been received well, and I think it's partly circumstantial in that everybody is feeling housebound, and now here's somebody traveling. And I think we found an interesting balance, I hope, between making a travel documentary and making a historical documentary. So there may be people who are expecting that what they're going to watch is a guy in a museum standing next to an object and talking about it. But it's far more free-flowing than that. It is just kind of random, kind of disconnected, just kind of going with me as I search the world. So it's got some quirky moments, like right to the ER with me and a broken arm, all the way to actually being inside museums and standing beside objects. So I think it's a very good complementary product to the book. The book focuses in on the objects we found and their stories, while the documentary focuses more on just the search, the fun, the chaos, and the international component of searching around the world for all these things.
Yeah. Tell us about how you broke your arm.
So I love photography, and wherever I can go, and this was part of the joy of this journey, is being able to take landscape photographs all around the world. And I went to Ireland. We were on the coast of Ireland, and just kind of got a little careless jumping from one rock to another, and those rocks were a little more slippery than I would have thought, and my footing was a little less than I would have thought, and so I went over and heard a strange crunch, and so anyways, got to check out Belfast's emergency room and got in and out really surprisingly quick, and it was a minorly broken arm, so it was okay. But One thing you don't see in the video is that same evening I had a meeting or a question and answer session at a local Christian bookstore. So I shook hands with a broken arm with about 150 people. So if you watch that video, you can see me grimacing with each handshake.
Yeah. Well, to begin with, you didn't actually think it was broken. You was told it wasn't broken, and then you got a phone call a couple of days later. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So the ER doctor took a look at the x-ray and said, I think it's fine, but I'll send it on to a radiologist for his perspective. Yeah. And then the radiologist took a look at it 2 days later or 3 days later, just as I think I just gotten home or was just heading home. Sure. And they called and said, actually, you should probably go get that looked at.
Yeah, wow. How hard was it to edit all the content you had, and how much gold ended up on the editing floor?
Oh, so much. So Stephen McCaskill, who traveled with me, he shot the film and he produced the film. He did all of that. But yeah, I think probably we got the film would reflect maybe 5 to 10% of the total footage. We took hours and hours, and a lot of it is just retakes or just boring stuff. But I think he had to trim it down massively and leave a lot that would have been quite interesting on its own, especially a lot of interviews and background material.
In the documentary, you mentioned that you had to go back to Rome twice. Why was the first trip unsuccessful, Tim?
The first trip was unsuccessful because, as one of my friends in Rome said, well, that's Rome for you, which is to say that on the day I went there, 2 of the 3 places I wanted to see were randomly closed. And no reason given, no explanation whatsoever. They just were closed. Yeah. And so as it turns out, I had to go back anyways because I went the first time before we started making a film project out of it. So it was just me alone in Rome. Yeah. Then we eventually would have had to go back anyways to film it. But yeah, it was just things were closed for no reason.
Did you get any opposition in any of the places that you went?
We had the easiest time of it. So I broke my arm, a minor break. That was the worst thing that happened all year, which is really not that big of a deal. Yeah. We never had any trouble. You know, a couple of museum curators were maybe not the least bit interested in having us in. 1 or 2 were kind of mean about it. I totally understand why you wouldn't want us to film in your museum. That's fine, but you don't have to be mean about it. Yeah. But other than that, no, we did so well. And I think in all the borders we crossed and everything else, and going into all these countries, I don't think I got more than like 12 or 15 questions all year. But often I would walk up to the border, they would take my passport, they would stamp it and hand it to me without even asking why I was there, which was remarkable. Not that I was doing anything bad, not that I had anything to hide, but it was so simple.
Wow. Were there any objects that you stumbled on by accident?
Yeah, there were a few. My favorite was Andrew Fuller's snuff box. For me, that was, I described that in the book. It shows up in the film as well. Such a quirky little object that in its own way is key to the history of the worldwide modern missions movement. And yet it's a snuff box. And snuff being a form of tobacco that you would snuff up your nose rather than smoke. So it was just one I had heard. I knew the object had been used in days past, but I didn't know that it still existed. In fact, I had been told it did not. And I tracked that down. Another one would be in Zambia, David Livingstone Museum there. Yeah. Found some neat objects there. We knew there was a museum, but just didn't have a website. There wasn't a good description of what was inside. But finding the traveling box he carried with him, and you could see on the top of the box little mounds of wax. So this is the box he would travel from place to place. He would set up the box at night, put a candle on it, and that's where he would write his journals. His journals, which were turned into books, which gave him worldwide notoriety and helped him in carrying out his work, his ministry. So, yeah, there were lots of neat little moments like that.
Wow. Did you go anywhere that you were keen to go back with the family?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So through all the travel, I accumulated, as you can imagine, a whole lot of travel miles and a whole lot of hotel points. So we cashed those in last summer and went as a family to Europe and retraced the route through parts of Germany and Switzerland and Austria. So that was an absolute joy. I would gladly go back to many of those places. Ecuador, I'd love to go back to, and Australia, New Zealand. I go there anytime anyways. So, there's lots of places I would gladly go back.
That's so good. Did anywhere or any of the objects that you were looking forward to see and not live up to expectations?
Oh, probably, yeah. There were some I couldn't find. So there were some I really wanted to track down, or I went to the Israel Museum and really just didn't find anything. I was looking for objects related to the Crusades, and I just couldn't find anything that was interesting. Little bits of broken pottery aren't going to tell much of a story. So there was that. And then the whole early church as well. I really went looking for objects that would tell the story of the early church between the founding of the church and really into the Middle Ages. And there's very little there as well. So that was a little bit of a disappointment, yeah.
Yeah, sure. You mentioned at the start of the interview that your mum and dad were first Christians within the Pentecostal denomination. In one of the episodes, you spent some time looking back at the history of a Pentecostal church. What did you find out, Tim?
Yeah, so we went to California, and so in this worldwide journey, we wanted to focus on Christianity, I guess you could say Protestantism, you could say evangelicalism, something like that as we start to narrow the categories. And I didn't think I could tell the story of Protestantism or the Christianity from the early days till now without getting into some things that I don't myself adhere to, like prosperity gospel, which would be a non-biblical, really a heresy or something close to it. And even things like Pentecostalism, where I can appreciate Pentecostals as believers and yet cannot be part of that tradition and disagree with some of the theology. But I did need to track down Pentecostalism because so many Christians have been influenced by it. True believers are either Pentecostal or hold to Pentecostal theology. So we went to California where the Azusa Street revival took place and found Bonnie Brae House there, which is where the whole revival broke out at that house. And so it's important to remember historically that Pentecostalism, though we take it for granted today, did not exist until the early 1900s. So it's very, very new to the scene in Christianity, and yet it very, very quickly swept over the entire world, so that today probably the majority of people on earth who call themselves Christians would have been directly impacted by some of the theology of early Pentecostals.
Yeah. What happened to give birth to the prosperity gospel out of that denomination, Tim?
Yeah, well, it quickly got twisted. So the original Pentecostals, they were looking for this, I guess, deeper experience, or this New Testament experience of Christianity. They were looking back at the book of Acts and seeing, well, if they were speaking in tongues, if they were doing these things, why shouldn't we? And so you can see, at least through my eyes, as you look back at it now, you can see them trying to force this thing, trying to find tongues where there were no tongues. And but even then, their theology was maybe not so bad in that they believed that tongues, as described in the New Testament, were actual human languages. And so the early Pentecostals, some of them were missionaries who were convinced that they were speaking Chinese, they were speaking some Indian language, and they would go around the world taking this language, thinking they could now communicate. It was only later, as they realized these aren't real languages, that they started to develop the theology that these are angelic languages or private prayer languages and so on. But out of Pentecostalism eventually grew the prosperity movement, and I guess it was just tied into it was tied into it some misunderstandings of Scripture and some, as people would say, over-realized eschatology and so on. And it really grew up in Tulsa under Oral Roberts there. We went to ORU and explored that a little bit.
Why is the prosperity gospel so dangerous?
Well, it promises things on this earth that are less important things than salvation by grace through faith in Christ Jesus, things that are less important than the promises God makes to us. And it buries Christians in this desire to have physical, financial, and health prosperity here on this earth. And so it offers people something they desire. You don't have to be a Christian to desire those things. In fact, many Christians or many non-Christians really have a deep longing for these things. And so it takes advantage of ignoble human desires or even human greed, and promises you can have those things through a relationship with Jesus Christ. And so it takes advantage of unsanctified desires and promises them as proof of Christianity. And of course, in the prosperity gospel, as we've seen, it really is almost like a Ponzi scheme in which only the people at the top truly prosper, and they prosper off the backs of the people down below them. So it's simply not sound theology. It's unbiblical theology, and it's very, very dangerous.
Tim, you're somebody that reads a lot of books, especially for a living as well, and you blog about them in your reviews. What's your best ever book that you've read? What's your favourite book?
I would usually go back to The Holiness of God by R.C. Sproul, and I don't really know how to say the best book, how to define that, but the one that changed my life. I'll often see people, they'll finish the book and 2 days later write a review and say, this book changed my life. And I would say, maybe, give it some time and see. You don't really know that right away. Yeah. But something like The Holiness of God, I can say that over the years, it's shown to me that it really did change my life. It shifted my view of God. It sharpened my view of God, made it far more accurate, and also sharpened my view of myself, made my self-understanding far more accurate, and allowed me to see the great chasm, the infinite chasm between myself and God. I think that's one that I recommend to everyone. I recommend widely, one I reread, and one that I'll never not be indebted to. Yeah.
And what's the most dangerous book you've read?
Oh boy, I've read some really miserable books over the years. That's been part of what I've done through the blog over the years, is try to focus in on some of the books that are unhelpful or even downright dangerous. So I don't know. I could probably point in any number of directions, but I think some of the worst books I've read would be things like The Shack, or even the whole heaven tourism genre, or Jesus Calling by Sarah Young. And in each one of these books, in one way or another, they're just pointing people away from the sufficiency of Scripture, the sufficiency of God's revelation to us in the Bible. And somehow they're tampering with that. And as soon as you draw people away from the Bible, you're into dangerous territory, aren't you?
Yeah. As Christians, we love to hear about all of the history. But if we had someone listening right now who isn't a Christian, how would you encourage them to follow Jesus?
Yeah, well, I think this little period of time we're going through right now, where we're dealing with this coronavirus, it maybe just lets us know in a new way what we've known all along, which are, we're really weak people. We're really small people. All of human society, the whole world has been put on hold due to a microscopic virus. Yet we think we're good. We think we're strong. We think we're powerful. And here we are. The whole world has stopped because of this thing. So I would encourage people just to admit your own weakness, admit your own smallness, admit your own frailty. And once you can do that, once you can see how little and small and frail you are, then I think you're in a good position. God gives grace to those who are humble. So if you humble yourself, realizing how small and weak you are, then go looking for the one who's big and strong and powerful, and look in the Bible, which is his revelation of himself, and I think you'll find him there.
That's an excellent place to finish, Tim. Thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed speaking to you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.